All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to all of you here in the room and all of you online with us. It's our pleasure today to have you here. The topic for today is a talk by Vincent Traag, who's going to speak about causal intricacies of bias in the research system. Vincent Traag is a researcher at the Center for Science and Technology Studies at Leiden University. He's a computational social scientist by training, also a mathematician, I think, by training, but he's a computational social scientist now. Vincent is part of the Templeton project that we're carrying out here at the Vrije University on epistemic progress in the university. I don't think this talk is officially part of that project, but it certainly is something that Vincent is working on together with a colleague. Without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to you, Vincent. So go for it.
Thanks. Nice to see you here and online. Let me get away from the screen share. See if this actually works. Yeah. Okay, then it works. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to talk today about bias in the research system, as Jeroen already said, and it's mainly focused on the types of things like gender bias or these types of things. I'll first have a brief introduction, and then I'll give some more detail. So in general, the types of things like equality or diversity and inclusion are quite on the agenda in general in academia. So this is one particular result from the National Network of Female Full Professors in the Netherlands. Not sure if that's the official abbreviation, I mean the Dutch one. But here it's the let's say the progression from students to full professors in terms of gender differences that we see. So you see that students are quite similar from both gender, both male and female. So the male is the blue ones, the females are green ones. Slightly more female that get their degree actually. So these are the ones that got a degree, not just the ones who enrolled as a student. Then you see here PhD students start being more male, university teachers, so assistant professors. Slightly more males here, associate professors, even more males than final professors, even more males. So there are these clear differences that we observe in the research system in academia. Also, different types of questions revolving around different ethnicities, having, for example, different reward rates in funding. This is from UKRI in the UK, where after parliamentary questions, they showed that indeed there is this difference that we observe in terms of funding rates, in terms of total grant sizes that are being awarded to different agencies. More recently, we show the next one. Oh yeah, there's a debate about, for example, the student population being too white at the University of Amsterdam. This was a debate that was, well, I think from 2017, and also too well, masculine, too many men being present, too less women being present. More recently, debate about the Vrije funding. So the Vrije awards from this year, well, so as you see here, all Dutch white males were funded, or only Dutch white males were funded, and no women were funded at all. So debate about, well, that it wasn't really looking good from that perspective of, let's say, inclusion and diversity. There is talk about what is called here citational justice. So whether there's differences in citations between different gender, also different ethnicities, possibly also different class backgrounds or whatever we can discern, and that there are these inequities in citations. So this is just to show that there is clearly attention for this topic in academia, and it's something that's let's say more broadly recognized. So these are just, let's say, general talks about the types of differences that we observe. I do see something in the chat. I'm not sure if
that was me just saying that I'm keeping an eye on the chat.
Oh, you're keeping an eye. Just going to
sorry.
Is somebody keeping an eye on the chat? And so here CWTS is an institute that's also producing an actual university ranking, what we call the Leiden ranking. It's a bit broader than what most of you will probably understand as a ranking. And so we also include, for example, gender statistics. It's a bit unfortunate that we have the overlay here of the Zoom share. Sure, I can get rid of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So these are, let's say, the percentage of female authors that we see from bibliometric databases for different universities. So this is a ranking, not in terms of impact, what some of you might be used to from other university rankings, but in terms of gender statistics. So which universities are have the most female researchers? So in this case, you see mostly, well, more Eastern European universities from Poland on top, and from Romania, Brazil here, and Chile, I think. So there are these attention that also we ourselves pay to these types of differences. Now, besides these types of differences and attention in general for these issues of diversity and inclusion and equality, there's also the word bias being used. And so this is, for instance, a recent study, I think from last year, perhaps the year before, already. So it was part of a big study on peer review and gender differences that we see in peer review. And they found no evidence of what they said gender bias in peer review. As this was also announced here, there was a bit of a discussion about it. Well, depending on how you view things, should you or should you not talk about bias? We'll get to that. Also here, a paper about citation bias in the end. Can't see it directly in the title. This is from inclusion, where it's due to systemic and individual gender bias. So also being talked about bias in terms of citations here, gender bias. And here a large plan, or giant even, what's termed here, to track diversity in journals. That's also talking about peer review and seeing how diversity and inclusion is present there. Again, to also here, to chart reduce bias in scholarly publishing. The question is, what do we mean by bias? What do we think bias is? And this is, at this point, at least, an open question. Does anybody of you have any idea, or just what do you think that is meant here with bias? Also for the online audience, I'm not sure if we can immediately hear you, or you're doing the sharing, I guess.
We'll simply read what people write in the chat.
Like a tendency to think in a certain way or to draw certain conclusions.
Okay.
Here it already seems as it talks about favorable treatment of certain groups in the 3 examples that you showed.
Okay. Favorable treatment, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I would say maybe more broadly, an over-representation of certain groups relative to the actual proportion of the research population or authors of papers or so.
Okay, over-representation. Any other suggestion?
I mean, I guess given the way it's being talked about in these headlines, it has to have some kind of normative bite to it. So it would have to mean not just over-representation, but over-representation beyond what's deserved. And so you mean something like the same quality of research produced by a man would be more favorably evaluated than otherwise equivalent quality research by a woman.
Okay.
That-
Sorry?
Yeah, which is what I said in
In terms
Okay,
of favorable
so-
treatment.
favorable treatment. Yeah,
Right.
but
Okay.
your definition of your explanation was a lot broader, which is nice.
Okay, but some similarities,
one
some
the same.
over-representation.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to steal your idea.
No,
No.
similar idea. Yeah, same idea. Other suggestions? I'm not sure if there's.
Yeah, so someone here in the chat wrote to perceive something or someone in a particular way. Driver behind that can be and usually are unconscious. Someone else writes, when the disparity is driven by a purpose or intention, it can be called bias. Which for this person, the first person who wrote something, makes bias is particularly difficult to measure.
Okay. Well, that's quite some diverse elements there, but also something, or some common elements, at least of something moral, something merit-based, something favorable, something, let's say, merit in terms of perhaps unfair, let's say, treatment of others. And also the word disparity was mentioned, which is an interesting other term, which I'll get to. Okay, so I think it's interesting to have some idea of what you are thinking, at least, the bias is. I have a proposal of what I think we should, or at least, well, perhaps one additional definition of bias, but at least a proposal for how we can think about bias, and it also relates to disparities, which I think touches upon, well, many of the elements that you asked us.
Vincent, one quick interruption. It turns out that the people online have difficulty hearing you, especially when you turn around towards the whiteboard. So
I'll
if you
talk
can
only if I,
speak in that direction,
yes.
yeah.
yes,
That'd be
normally I
great.
would have a computer with the slides on.
Yeah, of course.
Easier to have.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, sure. So what I'll do in terms of a presentation, I'll first try to define bias. In order to do so, I'll introduce very briefly something about causality, structural causal models. So that's, I assume that not everybody is aware or acquainted with these. So I'll try to very briefly have a sort of a mini introduction to causality and causal models, which hopefully is sufficiently introductory for all of you to be able to follow along the argument. Then I'll talk a little bit about fairness in AI, just double checking my order. So there's also a big debate about algorithmic fairness. So a lot of algorithms being used for all different types of things, for ranking research results, for recommending what film to watch, all different types of things. And there's a big debate in AI itself also about fairness. And I'll say something about that, how that relates to definitions that I have in mind. Finally, I'll say something, or not finally, before finally, I'll say something about some of the challenges in identifying biases and what they imply and how we can deal with them. And finally, I'll talk about a few case studies, let's say, real world cases, let's call them, and how I think this type of definition is informative for that particular debate. Okay, if there's something unclear while presenting, just interrupt also. Okay, so first on to defining bias. So let's start informally, and then I'll try to build it up towards a more formal definition of these things. So informally, I would like to say a bias is a unjustified, sorry, I do have to turn around sometimes because the pointer doesn't work. An unjustified direct causal effect. So this is something that is related to also merit, or possibly the merit, or more moral concerns for when something is justified or not. So that's the unjustified part. And a direct causal effect, relating slightly to the overrepresentation that you mentioned, but slightly differently, I think. The term disparity was already mentioned. This is also a term that is frequently used in this discussion, which is equally not always clear what is meant by it. Some sort of difference is clear, but it also has a slightly, let's say, connotation of unfairness. And how we think about defining it here is not as a direct causal effect, but as some causal effect that is due to some bias. And so the first one is a direct causal effect. This is a sort of more lengthy process where it involves some bias. And then finally, just about differences and about gender differences or different types of differences, just observe differences. So not making any claims about the causality and not necessarily making any claims about the fairness or justification of that particular effect. So these are just the informal definitions that I would like to give. Now I'll work them out in a slightly more formal setting. And for that, I'll briefly explain the causal model structure.
Can I ask one brief clarification? So you have direct causal effect in there. How much work is the directness supposed to do? I mean, you're presumably ruling out indirect causal effects, but
yes, for bias, yes, yes. I think that will become clear in the course of the rest of the presentation. Causal model structure. It typically looks like something like this. This is hypothetical examples. I'll mostly show hypothetical examples because much of our, let's say, knowledge about how things work causally is absent to a large extent. We are unaware how things work exactly. And so these are just possibilities. They're not meant to be, let's say, this is how it works and nothing else. So here in this hypothetical example, we have a couple of variables. So these are the different variables. So we here have gender, faculty position, citations, quality, journal. This notion of quality is something that is, let's say, take it broad. So just something like quality can be multidimensional, can be, well, whatever you have in mind, but something related to quality. I won't want to go too much in detail, but that is the type of idea.
So is it quality of a paper, of a person?
Yes, that is a bit mixed in this segment. So it can be quality of a person, but also that is, let's say, something that is affecting quality of papers. So quality, let's say, the research capacities of a person who translates in the quality that is in the end being present in or being visible in a research paper that in the end leads to a particular journal. So these are all different types of variables, one way or another, and each variable is assumed to be a function or an outcome of the, let's say, incoming errors, right? So gender and citations affect the faculty position, but and quality does so as well, but journal doesn't affect the faculty position, right? So this is just the basics of it. We don't care about what these functions look like and how they behave exactly. It's just about the structure, right? And it also says that exactly what I just said. So journal doesn't affect faculty position, at least not directly. Okay. So this is mostly based on work by Judea Kroll. This is a nice, more, let's say, popular science type of book that you can look at, which is interesting to read. This is a more hardcore stuff, which, if you're really interested, you can still read, but this might be nice to start with. So some of you are probably familiar with at least some of these concepts from more statistics. You all probably know the saying of correlation is causation, something similar. I'll try to explain here. So most of you are probably aware of mediators, right? So this is a variable that's mediating some of the causal influence. So we have some variable before, and then that affects some variable z here, and that affects again some outcome variable later. So this is mediating the influence between two other variables. I've got them green here because that is also allowing a flow of associations. So here, any variable before and any variable after are associated through this link. It's also causal, right? So it's really that its mediator is mediating the causal influence. This is different from what we understand as a confounder, right? So here, confounding is also generating an association between the variable that's here before and here after, but it's not causal, right? So this confounder is influencing them both, and that's why we see an association, but it's not causal. It's still green because it's allowing, let's say, this association to flow. Something that you might be slightly less familiar with is a collider. And so here it's not that, let's say, X and Y on this side are affected by the confounder, but X and Y here are affecting Z. Right? So this is called a collider. This doesn't generate any association. So here, X and Y are independent of each other. They're both affecting the third variable Z, but otherwise they're independent. Is this first part clear? Okay. Then there's a big difference when you condition on these variables. So if you start conditioning on these variables, it flips. It flips cyclically. So things that were open, let's say, that were allowing association to flow between them, become closed if you condition on these variables. So conditioning means selecting on them, only gathering data for a specific subset, including them in your statistical model, all different types of possible ways in which you can condition on a variable in one way or another. So controlling for it in one way or another. It closes these variables. So it closes the mediator, it closes a confounder, but, and here's the trick, it opens a collider. So if you select on something that is a collider, you allow association to be present, but this is not causal. Right? Is this clear?
So maybe it would help me if you could give us a concrete example.
Yes.
Okay, good.
So this is sort of the general background. So this is the 5-minute introduction to structural causal models. It's not all of it, but it should be enough to follow any of the further discussions. To give a concrete example. So for example, here we have, again, the same example as I showed before, with gender, faculty position, quality, citations, journal. Here, faculty position, it only has these incoming arrows, so it's a collider, right? That's a collider. Here, citations is a mediator. There's only, let's say, one incoming arrow and one outgoing arrow, so it's called a mediator. And here, quality is a confounder, right? It has 2 outgoing arrows. Now, these incoming and outgoing arrows are only with respect to a specific path that we can take. So, for example, look at the path between gender and journal. So if we have 2 paths there, so we have one path from gender to faculty position, quality to journal, and we have another path from gender to faculty position to citations to quality to journal. Right? All of them are closed, all of these paths. Why? Because faculty position is a collider. And so the whole path is closed. So path between 2 variables is open if all of the nodes are open. It's closed if all of these nodes are closed. So if we now, for example, condition on faculty position, we open
Any of it's closed if any of the nodes.
if any of the nodes is
Not
closed,
At least
Not
one.
all.
at least one is closed, then it's closed. So if all of them are open, it's open.
Yeah.
Did I say anything correctly?
You said if all are closed.
Yeah, no, if all are open, it's open. If any is closed, it's closed. Yes. So this is now inducing this association between gender and journal, conditional on faculty position. So we condition on faculty position, and then we see an association appear between gender and journal. Right? So both paths are in this case open. We can, for instance, also condition on citations. Then we close this. Then we close one path. So then we have one path, gender, faculty position, citations, quality, journal, which is closed. Right? But there's still one path open. The path from gender to faculty position to quality to journal. Right? So there's still an association between gender and journal, also if we condition on citations additionally. This quality here is a bit vague. I've drawn it vague because we don't observe it directly. So these things we potentially observe, perhaps not in every study, but at least potentially we could observe. Quality is something that we can't observe directly, right? We can't say or measure it directly, saying this is quality. Fickle quality. And that will play up in some of the problems. This is what we call backdoor path. It'll come back in some. So a backdoor path is something that is not representing causality. So if you look here at the effect of gender, it just has an effect on faculty position, right? It doesn't affect quality. It doesn't affect citations. It doesn't affect journal. There's no causal path from gender to journal, meaning a path that we can follow only on directed links. It's only on these undirected links that we work well following it. The causal links in the reverse direction, let's say. Right? So it doesn't represent a causal influence, it just represents an association.
In these sorts of models, do you ever get bidirectional links, or is it always unidirectional?
Yes, potentially you can have that, but that is just to link to say that they are associated in one way or another, and we're not exactly clear about the details of how they are associated. Okay. So then we can start working on the more formal definitions of what we mean with bias and disparity. So with a bias, and I understand it also as a procedural fairness component, is any direct causal effect of X on Y that is unjustified. So we have a direct effect somehow, right, from one thing to another, and we think that is unjustified. So for instance, if there was a direct effect of gender on, let's say, funding outcome, we would think that that is unjustified. It doesn't make any sense to take into account in the funding decision whether it's a man or a woman who applied or the other gender. And so for that reason, we think that effect is unjustified, and it's why we call it bias. It doesn't need to be gender, it can also be, let's say, length of a person, including that in funding. It doesn't make any sense. Perhaps for basketball it makes sense, so there it might be justified. For research funding, that's absolutely nothing to do with it. So we think it's unjustified.
Sorry.
It was your message, I'm sure. A disparity is then any causal effect, so any X that is somehow influencing a Y, so along a causal path, so only a directional, that includes some bias. Although notice bias is with the red arrow here, right? So it's some effect that is somehow including a bias. And finally, a difference is just anything that is associated. So any difference that we observe is a difference. And it also doesn't come with, in these proposed definitions, with any moral, let's say, component of being unjustified or justified. So difference is just the most neutral term that we introduce here. And so this is dependent, as I put here in footnote, dependent on whether we condition or something or not. Right? So we might observe some differences in some cases, not in other cases. And then, of course, the question is it causal or not? And so that's one component. But it's also a neutral term, or at least that's what we suggested. Okay. So again, let's see them in a small example. So for example, you probably know this Simpson paradox, where there was a gender difference in acceptance rates in a university in California somewhere. And then they controlled for which department was being accepting the different candidates. And it turned out that there was a big difference in women applying to certain departments, which showed a lower acceptance rate. And that was driving the complete, let's say, difference in acceptance rates for the entire university. So this is something like this. Gender is driving research field, or department in that case, and that is driving the acceptance rate of students at the university. Now, we might think differently about what is a bias here. So we might think, well, there's a gender bias in the research field. Right? There is an unjustified effect of gender on research fields. Perhaps women have become, let's say, for some reason, turn away from some fields which are perhaps too masculine or something. And this is an unfair and unjustified effect of gender on research field. So then we have a gender bias in research field, but a gender disparity in acceptance. Right? So there's one bias that is part of this chain, but the bias is not located in the acceptance, the bias is located in the research field. The other possibility here is there's a bias in acceptance, right? Research fields shouldn't drive the acceptance. We should just look at applications and accept them, irregardless of how many places there are available for a particular research field or for a particular department. That should be, if there's just more applicants from a certain research field, there should just be more places for that research field. So this is bias. It's not that gender is driving the bias, let's say, in the research field. Perhaps that's a justified effect that women have a different interest than men. Could be. So we don't think that that is justified. It's the unjustified influence of research fields. Of course, both can also happen, right? Both are biased, or both represent biases. Irregardless of where the bias is located, there's still a gender disparity. It could also be that we say, okay, well, these are both just justified effects. I mean, women have different interests, and it makes sense that we just have funding for particular departments, which is limited, and if there are more people who apply, there's a lower acceptance rate. So we can't do anything about it. It's justified. How we see things. So then there's not a gender bias or a gender disparity, but a gender difference. Still a causal one in this case, but it's a gender difference in our terminology. Okay. Are these ideas clear? Or is there any question about proposed definitions? Oh, one thing that I should mention, by the way. So here I said the bias is a procedural fairness. So if there is a bias in any causal effect, that represents something that is unfair at that level of the process. if there's a disparity, the outcome is unfair. Irrespective of that constitutes really the bias or not, right? So here, if we think about the bias being located in the research field, then somehow the process of determining the research field is unfair. It's an unfair process. We're not exactly sure perhaps how this works, but that somehow represents an unfair process, right? Now here in this case, so where the bias is located in the gender and research field, there's no bias in research field and acceptance. So the acceptance decision, that is fair, right? We're not taking into account gender here, we're just looking at the research field. We don't care about gender. So that process is fair. The outcome is still unfair because there is a bias in the research field, right? So the disparities are about outcome fairness and the biases are about procedural fairness. Okay, so let's look at fairness in AI. Fairness in AI is looking at a particular type of fairness, namely if the prediction is typically fair. They don't care about the real world, so to say. They care about their prediction, whether that is fair. And I think the definitions that we just gave are also applicable to that type of situation. So in that type of situation, we are mostly concerned with the outcome. Is the outcome fair? So we're applying the notion of disparity. And so here it's the outcome is fair if there's no disparity, and the prediction is fair if there's no disparity. It's always with respect to a certain variable, right? So no gender disparity or racial disparity or well, whatever we can think of in terms of disparity comparisons. So here in this case, there's again a bias of gender and productivity and a effect on a causal effect of faculty position. Right? So then productivity is unfair, right? It's disparity. It's even there's a bias even there, so it's even procedurally unfair. But it's also a disparity. So the outcome is unfair. The outcome of the faculty position is also unfair because it's exactly a consequence of this particular bias. So the faculty position is not determined only by the productivity, it's also, for instance, and again, these are all hypothetical examples of impact, of whatever impact, societal impact or citation impact. Suppose it's also fine. Now, if we predict the faculty position of someone purely based on the impact, which is not related to gender, that's a fair prediction. Right? We're not considering gender itself. We're not considering any other variables that are biased themselves or that have a disparity themselves. So the prediction is fair, even though that the actual outcome is unfair. And this is something general. So in this case, we're at least using our terminology, the outcome can be fair, even though that the prediction is unfair, and vice versa. The prediction can be, not sure what I just said, but unfair while the actual outcome is fair, and vice versa. Let me keep it at that. And most existing fairness criteria are at odds with exactly this type of definition. And I'll just show one example. I'll try to keep it brief. I'm not sure how I'm doing in time, actually, but I'll try to keep it brief, but just say.
Oh yeah, so it's yeah. I mean, it sort of depends on how much time you want for Q&A, but you could go on for another 20 minutes, and then we just half an hour for.
Yeah.
Okay.
And also, I'll just show one existing fairness criteria. So there are lots of definitions being provided. It's a very active research field, and I don't think that I have a complete overview of all of the things ongoing with fairness criteria or fairness criteria in AI. But at least a couple of prominent ones are at odds with this definition. I'll just show you one, and that is the one of what's called separation. This is a relatively formal definition. Well, they are formal definitions, but I'll try to make it clear here. So here the prediction, so any prediction is fair if the path, so if we draw any causal model, if the path between the original variable of interest, say gender, and the actual prediction is closed, if we condition on the actual outcome. I'll draw a picture again to give an example. And this is actually identical to demanding equal error rates. So that whenever we do a prediction, the error rate for both men and women is the same. Which intuitively might make sense, right? We are not making larger error rates with women so that we have an unfair prediction because there's somehow a larger error being made for them. We demand equal error rates, and for that reason, this should be constituted as or thought of as a fair prediction. So that's what this criterion says. So if we here look at this, this is an example again, gender affecting faculty position, affecting publications, and publications are being used in the prediction. Right? So prediction of faculty position is based on the publications. As we don't know the faculty position, we only know the faculty position if we really did a survey of people, but we typically know the publication. So maybe we want to predict faculty positions based on the number of publications. So if we look at this, then the path between gender and the prediction is closed if we condition on the faculty position. This is a mediator, right? And if we condition on it, we close it. So the path is closed. So the path is closed. Okay, well, good. Then it's fair and it satisfies separation. At the same time, this bias from gender to faculty position, according to our definition, constitutes a disparity, also in publications, hence also in prediction. So there's a disparity in the prediction, and so we say it's actually unfair. Well, this criterion will say it's fair. And intuitively, I think it also wouldn't make sense to call this fair, in the sense that this just reproduces the original bias that is in the system. So having equal error rates, that makes sense if the original outcome is fair. Right? Then it's perfectly fine to ask for equal error rates. But if the original outcome is unfair, well, then your prediction will be equally unfair. So it doesn't, let's say, improve anything. It's still unfair. Okay, this is just to show that these definitions that are currently more popular in AI, I think not useful for this particular debate and better understanding what are biases and what constitutes fairness. And I think more generally that using any of these formal criteria to say whether something is fair or not, just based on, let's say, the data, is very difficult or even impossible. So these are just structural conditions, and depending on the exact structural condition, it may be fair or not according to these criteria, but it doesn't say whether it's justified or not. Right? So if we think that there's an influence that's still justified, then these criteria would say, no, that's unfair. While we think, yes, but a difference, gender difference in the research field, that's reasonable. That's not a problem, right? That is just a difference in interest between that might be justified, right? These types of conditions don't take that into account. Vice versa, it says things that are fair, while we think, no, that's not fair, right? Which is perhaps the more problematic part. Okay, so this was just on the fairness area to say that this is something that is problematic. I think, yeah. So now on to some of the challenges of bias, of both identifying bias and of what to do about it. How do we think about, let's say, their consequences and implications? So if we look at again a similar example, right? Same example that we've a very close example that we've seen already multiple times in this presentation. So again, gender is affecting faculty position, and because it's a bias here, there's quality affecting both the faculty position, citations, and journal. Again, citations are affecting faculty position. Journal is not here for sake of argument. And so here we have this faculty position, this gender bias in faculty position. And if you control for it, right, then we induce an association. We already saw that previously, but it's not part of the causal chain. So there are no disparities in citations and in journals in this case. There is gender differences. Not because it's unfair, but because it's fair. Well, not because it's unfair or not. But it doesn't represent a causal effect at all. There is no causal effect between gender and journal, even though that there is a gender bias in faculty position, according to these definitions. Okay. So what should we do then? Well, clearly this bias in faculty position is something that should be addressed. Right? So there's bias here, there's an unjustified effect, and that shouldn't play a role in any process leading to a faculty position. It shouldn't be taken into account. That's unfair. The gender differences in citations and journals, they are merely a result of the fact that we limit our analysis to people that have a faculty position. So if we study only people that have a faculty position, we will see a difference between the different genders. Not because of there's any causal effect of the one or the other, but simply because we condition on this particular variable. So that doesn't require any intervention. That doesn't require it to solve that situation because there is no effect. We can try to say, okay, well, we should make citations here more equitable because there's a gender difference. But citations are not given with gender in mind or anything. They're just a result of this gender difference that we observe of the conditioning and respective position. So even if we do intervene there and say, you should pay attention to your differences in citations, that is something that's not affected because there is no effect there. And if there's no effect there, then this intervention of you should pay attention to how you're citing things because you're perhaps implicitly, which I think was also mentioned, or unconsciously biased in favor of men or in favor of women. That is not happening here. It's not happening in this process. Of course, again, it's hypothetical. So suppose that there's one additional fact. We have here funding in addition. And funding is determined based on faculty position. So perhaps you're only eligible for funding if you have a faculty position, postdocs, PhDs, not allowed for this particular program. And based on quality, right? So quality somehow, as I said, it's a bit vague in this sense. So quality perhaps of a person turning into quality of a funding application and then determining funding outcome of whether you're funded. Right, so receiving funding in this hypothetical example again is just based on these two outcomes of faculty position and quality. And these we think are fair in this case, right? The bias is in gender, the disparity is still in funding, right? So the outcome here of funding is still unfair, not because the funding process is unfair, but because there were prior biases that affect the final outcome of funding, right? So what should we do there? Should we intervene in funding or should we do something else? I'm actually curious, perhaps there are suggestions or thoughts. I'll get back to it later as well, but just wondering. What do you think?
It depends on the causal model. I mean, it depends on the actual causal structure.
Yeah, of course. Given this hypothetical model, right? So
Okay.
in this hypothetical, suppose that the world works like this, should we do something or not?
One argument you often hear is funding, tweaking funding can change hiring policies, like in a sort of feedback loop, and then solve gender bias.
So there the bias is not so much. So there the funding is, let's say, affecting again whether people get a funding effective position. After.
I just think in general, I mean, in this model, clearly no, but people will immediately think, assume that there are other causal paths from funding to other variables that matter. And I think everybody believes that, I think.
Okay.
I would guess.
All right.
So I'm thinking, I mean, even in this model, if there's no bias in other parts of the process, you might want to introduce a sort of counter bias to prevent disparities.
Yeah.
And it's sort of, unfair in the opposite direction, but maybe we want like a fair outcome. We want to get rid of the disparity.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean,
Yeah, sure. No, I'm just asking here.
yeah, okay.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that be unfair?
Sure. So I mean, sure, I can see that. It's sort of, maybe it's a bad idea to like try and fix an unfair process by introducing another unfair process that's unfair in a different way. You're sort of only adding on to the unfairness, but at least you get rid of the disparity, which is something you might care about, right?
So one thing is that the thing with bias, or at least in this way of thinking of it, is that this bias ripples through the network, right? So one bias generates all types of disparities. And this is, of course, one is hypothetical, second, it's very limited. And in the real world, let's say this effect that gender will have on faculty position, it will play much more effects, right? It will have effects on, I don't know, where you're invited on interviews, or if you appear on late night talk shows, or if you, I don't know, I mean, tons of different effects that are probably affected by this single bias, if there was this single bias, right? So it's also ripping through the network, and you wouldn't just need a counter disparity in that particular case, but
Yeah.
across the whole system. But still, I mean, that might be I'll get back to this, but nice to have some discussion. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, this is kind of, I think I agree that the actual causal model matters so much because
Yes.
like funding also has an effect on quality. The more funding you get, the more time you have for research, the more people you can hire to work under you, and you're going to produce better work. So like, well, maybe, but probably.
Effect on quality.
Unless you're a terrible manager.
Effect on time, at least.
Yeah. So like, I feel like in many of these things, the actual causal structure is going to have a lot of bidirectional errors, and that makes things even more complicated. I realize it's a toy example, but I guess things are generally going to be a lot more complicated than the toy example.
Completely agree. Yeah. Okay. So one additional complication is, and that is something that is fundamental in it, is there a gender bias in funding? So here, the question of this dashed arrow here from gender to faculty, is that present? Just a direct causal effect. If it is a direct causal effect, I think all agree that is unjustified. So we call it bias. So the question is there a bias in funding? Now, if the causal structure looks anything like this, where the faculty position is determined. Oh, you want to see me? All right. If the causal structure has something like this, where the quality is affecting the funding and both the faculty position, right? Then you have this sort of impossible scenario. There are two paths between gender and funding in this case, right? One is directly from gender to faculty, well, directly. One is a causal effect from gender to faculty position to funding, right? But we don't want the direct, the indirect effect there. We want the direct effect. If we want the direct effect, we don't want to leave this pathway of this indirect effect open, right? Because then we are measuring, actually, when we try to measure it, we're measuring the total effects, or at least also including this indirect effect. Well, we want the direct effect. So we should close it. And that introduces another problem, because as soon as we close it, it functions as a collider. And I haven't shown this, say, this twilight zone of a node acting both as a collider and as a mediator, but that completely, I should use proper language, messes up the types of inferences that we can make here. So if we condition on faculty position, we open this backdoor path through quality. And that affects also the outcome. So then we also don't have a proper measure of the direct effect of gender on funding. Right? So if we don't condition on it, we leave open this mediating path, which is a causal path, but we don't want to measure that. We want to measure the direct effect. And if we do condition on it, we get this vector path, this non-causal path, which is still open, which we also don't want. So we shouldn't condition on it, and we should condition on it. So there's no way out. We can't do anything directly here. This makes it very difficult. And this is, I think, something that is quite difficult to get out of in many situations. So this particular thing between all of these 3 or 4, so here the quality is unobservable and plays a key role in driving many of these effects, supposedly, right? I don't know. I don't know many of these causal structures indeed, and probably many things are much more complicated than what's shown here. But already, if part of the causal structure looks like this, then it's difficult. So if gender affects the faculty position in this way and the funding, and both are affected by this unobservable variable, even not unobserved, it's not like we should measure it and then we're done, then we can correct for it. And this unobserved variable, then it's very hard to determine whether there is any direct causal effect, at least based on, let's say, observational phenomena. And so this plays a role in this setting, but you can think of 1,000 examples that have a similar type of structure. So, for example, is there gender bias in citations? Well, both the journal and the citations are somehow driven by whatever this quality is, and observable, then we get the same situation. So rather difficult to determine whether there's any direct cause. Same thing for, let's say, review outcomes of papers and actually submission. Perhaps submission informs whether papers are submitted. So it's not even the outcome that we show here. Well, it's just submitted a journal, reviewed there, it's the outcome. But there might be, let's say, this intermediate effect here between gender and journal, saying, you know, you should look at the review outcomes. But then you have this problem with submissions. Perhaps it's a problem with submissions, but then perhaps it's a problem with etc., etc. So this is usually complicated in order to actually identify these causal effects, especially in the presence of these unobservable variables. There are some possibilities, of course, to do experiments, and these are also being done, like letters of CVs, blinded or not, different names, different, let's say, gender-based names, or these stereotypical gender names, differences in blinded peer review versus, or double-blind peer review versus single-blind peer review, where you can observe differences, for example, in the same review without or with the author names present. So these are possible ways in which we could try to measure something of these effects. But generally, this is very difficult in just observational studies, because we have this. Okay, so let me go to a couple of, let's say, case studies, or well, applications of definitions over here. So last year, it was the year before already, there was this paper published about mentoring of junior, let's say, researchers by senior researchers, and they studied the outcomes of that mentoring process. And in particular, looked at impact of these people. And what they found is that candidates that were mentored by female mentors showed a lower impact. And so this it's very small here, but I'll read it out loud. While current diversity policies encourage same-gender mentorships to retain women in academia, our findings raise the possibility that opposite gender mentorship may actually increase the impact of women who pursue a scientific career. And this was, questioned, and was that this is actually hurtful for the position of women as mentors, and is actually hurting their careers and potential mentorship, let's say, positions. And so there was a alert, and a couple of days even later, I think, I'm not sure, not long afterwards, saying, well, there's a problem here, and so here it says, in a way that undermines the role of female mentors and mentees. And in the end, it was retracted, I think, a month later or so. It's ended up being retracted. Let's try to see how this could actually work. Again, hypothetical causal models that could at least also explain some of their findings. So suppose that part of the relevant process looks like this. So there is a gender of the mentee and a gender of the mentor, and it's playing a role on whether people stay in academia. There seems to be some evidence that is suggesting that, for example, if women are mentored by women, that they have a higher chance of staying in academia, that they continue in science, while if women are mentored by men, they have a lower possibility of actually staying in academia. And so maybe this is actually a causal effect, perhaps not practically clear, but maybe that is representing some part of this process. The study by these authors focused only on, I think, that had at least 3 papers or 5 papers, I don't remember, but at least has some degree of staying in academia. So selecting on this particular variable implicitly, right, by limiting the study only to those authors who have more substantial career than just having one publication and disappearing again from academia. At the same time, we can expect again this quality to appear here that is affecting the probability of staying in academia. If you're a better researcher, you might be expected to stay longer in academia. And at the same time, we might expect that there's some process going on that is determining your citations, right? So if you write better stuff, you might expect that you get more citations. Now, if you condition on the staying in academia right? Then the women who do stay in academia, who have a male mentor, they are less likely to show a low quality. So if you're conditioning on staying in academia, right? And you are less likely to stay in academia if you're a woman mentored by a man, then most likely you will show a higher quality, right? So if that is the process driving it, then you will see that mentees that are mentored by a man will show higher citations. Right? Again, it's not a causal effect, it's just a difference. It's not a disparity in our terminology, it's just a gender difference. It doesn't mean that there is something going wrong with citations. It's just that something is going wrong with staying in academia. The, let's say, advice, the policy advice or the policy implications that were suggested, perhaps women should be mentored by men instead of women, is actually hurtful in this case. It doesn't improve their impact. Well, yes, it ends up that so if you select on those who stay in academia, their impact is higher only because women are less likely to stay in science. So if you want to improve the representation of women in science, you should not pair with a man. You should pair them with a woman because then they're more likely to stay in science. Yes, they might have lower citations, but that is not because they are mentored. That's just a selection effect. So completely incorrect, let's say, I should say, possibly completely incorrect, because I'm not sure that this is the proper causal model. If it is, this is driving incorrect results and incorrect policy advice. And again, intervening in citation here itself is inconsequential. It doesn't drive this difference, right? It's just a selection effect of selection on this collider. And that is also something that is, I think, well, or at least can be talked about. So if we have here, so this paper argues that there are gender biases in citations, right? But that's not the only literature out there on citations. So there are also other works on citations showing, well, if we control for these and these and these variables, then we don't see any difference anymore. Exactly the same problem appears there. Is this a causal effect or not? Right? Perhaps two effects completely cancel each other out. So are we really sure that this says that there is no bias in citations? Again, rather difficult to judge. We just seen this quality messes up everything. And so probably these things are, let's say, not uniquely interpretable, saying, okay, this is no bias, right? Similar effect here, these small differences being visible. So, okay. But the general thing is still, if there is no bias in the citations, oh here, sorry, this is still the picture of citational justice that calls attention to, we should pay attention to the citation process by looking explicitly also at who we cite and for what reason. That if there's no bias here, then this is not effective, right? There is no causal pathway there driving the difference in citations that is based on gender. And so paying more attention to gender will, let's say, correct that effect. Right? There might still be other reasons for intervening there, but at least not this bias necessarily. Right? And so if it's there, you should intervene. If it's not there, then you need to think about it. And so let us consider one more case. The date, 2019. So TU Eindhoven suggested to only hire women for at least, I believe, 6 months. So in the first 6 months, only women would be allowed to apply for a position. And if nobody would have applied or no suitable women would have been found after 6 months, then a man could be hired. So this raised some debate and was actually put for the was here the College for Human Rights. I think it's a European institution, maybe a Dutch one. I'm pretty sure.
The rights of men.
Yeah. And they judged this is actually discriminatory. You shouldn't do this. So they judged you can't have this policy in this way. After which they changed something in the way that they hire people. So I think it's now only for specific positions in specific departments that show a particularly large underrepresentation of men or women, I should say, that I believe they take into account. I haven't been able to figure out their exact policy at this moment, so, but they're allowed to do it in a slightly revised form. Now, let us briefly reflect on the question that I also asked earlier. How should we intervene? Oh, sorry. Here, there's this question of gender bias. I should say that as well. So there's been some studies. So this is from 2021, 2020, that try to do this in this experimental fashion, right? Submitting CVs and letters, and trying to, this is a Nordic experiment, trying to see if there's some differences in whether there's a man or a woman on the CV, whether that drives any of the differences. Here, there's something similar, a bit older, for I think it's US based, for a similar type of experiments where there's actually preference for men instead of for women in this experiment. So it's a bit the question of, is there really a bias in the hiring process or not, right? Or is it a disparity? And so again, we don't know what the causal model looks like, but we can at least think about what would causal models or what could causal models look like. So suppose that something like this is happening. Gender has a bias on childcare. Women more likely to be involved in childcare, to take more time for childcare, to be more at home for childcare. And we think that is unjustified, right? That shouldn't be the case. So we think that men and women should equally be involved in terms of childcare. So there's bias. And childcare is also affecting productivity, which you have less time, you work less hours, so you're less productive, and you're able to write less papers, or do less work, or do less research, or to write a paper. So that somehow affects your productivity. At the same time, that is affected by your quality. Can you quickly get to a result, or are you taking a long time to, let's say, make yourself acquainted with the literature? And that is probably also affecting in one way or another the hiring decision, or at least that's what we would hope that happens. Now, there's this gender disparity in hiring, right? Not a gender bias, but a gender disparity in hiring. Now, how should we address this? So this is similar to the question that I asked earlier. So one possibility is obviously doing something like was suggested in the Eindhoven. And similar to what you suggested earlier, we should have this additional effect. And so this is exactly this part, right? So in hiring, we should include gender as an additional effect in order to counter that disparity, right? And so that essentially introduces this other effect. It doesn't solve, let's say, the gender disparity in productivity, but it does solve potentially at least the gender disparity in hiring. Right? So that's also at least one disparity. I think that Hans in the back said that this also introduces some other unfairness, or perhaps it was someone else, I'm not entirely sure. But it raises some other questions of fairness and of potential effects of this introduction of the additional. So it doesn't solve the original bias, right? So it still shows this disparity in terms of productivity. Yes, it is countered here in hiring, but the principle is still present. Now, what is the potential outcome of this process? So who gets hired, or let's say has a larger likelihood of being hired? It's especially women who don't have kids, right? It's not women who have kids that are more likely to be hired, it's more women. So it doesn't matter whether you have kids or not, it matters whether you're a woman or not. And so who gets hired? Most likely women without kids, or who are not taking care of the kids. Then it's women still who do have kids, okay? And women are still being involved. Then it's men. Then it's men without kids, right? Who don't have childcare, they have still higher productivity. Childcare has this effect on productivity. And then finally, you get men who take care of children are the least likely to be hired. But this is just reinforcing exactly the stereotype of gender on childcare. So it's not countering it, it's actually aggravating it. It's making it worse. It's not making it better. And so by having this particular effect, it might actually damage this particular idea of we should be open to women and we should have, let's say, make sure that they have possibilities of having kids while having a career. This is saying, no, you still shouldn't have kids. That's just what. If you're a man, definitely don't have kids. Definitely don't take care of the children. If possible, let your wife do it because otherwise. Yeah, that's actually. Now, there are also some other possibilities, right? We can try to get rid of the bias in childcare. That would be ideal. 5 more minutes.
Okay, yeah, so that leaves us 15 minutes for questions.
Oh, then, okay.
It's a long time. That's good.
So we can get rid of the gender and the bias in childcare, which is ideal, but probably a longer term goal, which we should probably strive for, but that is, let's say, a bit too long for solving certain disparities. One other thing, and that is, I think, happening more often, also in funding, eligibility, for example, also taking into account possibly in hiring. How much time for research did you actually have? Did you take parental leave? Did you take maternity leave? Is there any effect that we should consider so that productivity is a proper indicator for quality? So productivity, if you're using that for a hiring decision, you don't want the productivity to be informative of childcare or representative of childcare. You want to be let it be representative of quality. Right? And so by having this correction of productivity in terms of childcare, so that we know, okay, you were out of the running, let's say you take paternity leave or maternity leave for 1 year or for 1.5 years, that makes a difference compared to another candidate who didn't. You had 1 or 2 years more to work in your career, so to speak, so that you consider that it should be corrected for. And with that, I'll skip this last one and just go to the conclusions. So first point is that the definitions of bias and what somebody means with bias, saying that there's no bias or saying that there is bias, is not always clear. And not always clear what's meant by this. I think what we propose here is a reasonable definition that I think captures many aspects that were raised, let's say overrepresentation, fairness, moral concerns, all these different things. So I think that is an improvement over, let's say, leaving it undefined. Similar to associations not being representative of causality, here the differences are not equal to main bias. Not all differences that we observe automatically mean that there is bias there for this parent. They might, and we should discuss that and we should talk about it. But it's not necessarily the case that is so. Finally, these I already said AI definitions I think are inappropriate. Then addressing these biases and disparities in one way or another, regardless of what types of policy actions we can take, I think should be informed by more causal reasoning and understanding of then also potentially their side effects, similar to what we just discussed in terms of the childcare example. And then finally, this is of course something that is not, let's say, specific to gender, and is also applicable to all different types of discussions that we have in the research system at large. So discussions about prestige bias, about bias in peer review, just based on the prestige of institutions or authors, bias in terms of novelty, in journals not publishing novel research, or in funding, that there's a bias against novelty or interdisciplinarity, etc. So I think this definition is also applicable in these types of cases that can lead to, let's say, a fruitful reflection on what we exactly mean, what we want to measure, and what the implications are of what we've actually measured. So that's it. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Vincent. This was amazing, I thought. Let's open it up for questions from the audience here and also the audience online. Yeah, Mark.
So you conclude by saying we need to think about causality, but then the question is, well, how do we do that in such a way that we actually don't use toy examples, but use more plausible ones? That's extremely difficult. And I imagine you agree.
Yes.
So I guess one alternative would be to ask, what kinds of, what do we want the overall outcomes to look like? And perhaps in order to just aim for those directly, and possibly that involves introducing a whole bunch of additional unfairnesses. But if the outcome at the end is roughly the shape that we want, then as long as the Rube Goldberg machine spits out something like an acceptable result, we don't actually need to know all of the causal structure.
So with the first part, I completely agree, obviously. So it would be nice to have a better idea of what is actual causality in many of these aspects. And yes, there are many, let's say, feedback loops that in the end affect positions, affect citations, and whatnot. So there's much stuff to be, let's say, looked at there. So yes, that I agree completely. I think that even if we don't have the causal models, that it merits thinking about what would be plausible models. I don't think that these are completely unrealistic. I think these are indeed toy examples, but that show what are possible effects of taking a certain action in certain cases. And being aware of the effectivity of certain policy suggestions that are made. So if there is, let's say, an implicit bias training in citations, well, there's no bias there, then we can do it as much as we want. It is simply ineffective. So it doesn't solve anything. If we say, okay, you should at least cite this many women in your reference list, yes, quota will clearly have an effect. But so it helps to think about what are possible consequences of our introduced or suggestions. Similar to the mentorship paper, it's possible that it doesn't work like the way that I suggested, right? But if that is, then the advice is completely opposite to what you would want. So it doesn't solve the problem, it makes the problem worse, actually.
Well, I don't think so. In that case, it's, if I understood correctly, the mentorship thing, basically the model you were suggesting is that for women, choosing a male mentor is a high risk, high reward strategy. So if it works, then they're likely to have more citations than they would if they had a woman as a mentor. But if it doesn't work, they're completely out of academia.
I see the two women nodding. They're shaking their heads, think no.
No, I thought that's what the model suggests,
No,
not that it's
no,
true.
Well, no, you.
But go ahead.
No, I'm curious.
Well, if I remember correctly, then it doesn't. It's only like in the gender of the mentor only affects whether you stay, and it has nothing to do with how well you do if you stay. So that's why it's it's the spurious. The relationship is spurious because it's or spurious. I don't know if that's the right term, but it's only if you condition on the collider only for people who stay, because the staying is because of this problem. So it doesn't,
Yeah, so in this model,
basically the having a male mentor will not lead you to have more citations. It won't. It only affects whether you stay. So there is no high reward. There's just
There's just
that's
risk.
just risk. Yeah.
There's just risk.
Yeah, sorry.
But exactly because of that risk, you seem to have, because you're less likely to stay if you get paired with a man, then, well, if you endure academia with a man, let's say, then, well, you're probably so good that you also have high citation.
Yeah. I think that's how.
That's perhaps one way to understand. So there is indeed not an effect on, let's say, the reward in this case. In this hypothetical example again, but if this is driving it, you're making the wrong recommendations. So that's why I'm saying, even if we don't know exactly what it looks like, it merits thinking about what it could look like in order to make sure that we take the proper actions instead of taking the improper actions. But this is also an argument for, I think, exactly discussing the outcome of that paper.
Yeah.
Not saying it's hurtful for women. Yes, the recommendation was hurtful for women. But whether this is a reasonable causal model that is explaining their results and their observations, and hence we should take the opposite action, I'm not sure of, right? So this is one possibility. There might be other possibilities in which it might still merit being paired with a woman. I don't know everything as well either, of course. So, but we should discuss it, and we should know what the causal, let's say, structure is of these things in order to make useful recommendations for policy.
So a question from the online participants, a question from Ali, in fact. So he's asking about how, well, should we keep an eye out for the empirical results that are giving you the details about the causal model? And I guess, I mean, the answer to that would be yes. We should keep an eye out for those. But maybe, I mean, do you have? Maybe can you speak to how much empirical work there is, or how much we actually know about, or do you think that much of the empirical work out there is actually plagued by the sort of ambiguities and uncertainties that you've been talking about today?
So I think, let's say, the idea of a causality playing a role there, I think, is insufficiently taken up in the literature in this, in studies on academia. I've also been looking at, there's a big debate about racial disparities in police shootings in the US. Similar type of questions arise, similar type of, I think, a much more serious, much more heavy subject, I think, than the gender disparities here. But, well, regardless of that. There, in that literature, there seems to be much more attention for exactly these questions of causal structure than seems to be the case in most of this discussion here. And I would like to see more work that is obviously, well, that's probably obvious when talk, that does pay attention to this. And so any of the academic or the empirical literature that is showing some outcome should still be considered. Of course, I'm not saying that this is not useful because they don't have a particular causal model in mind, and hence it's not informative. It is informative, but you have to think about what are reasonable ideas that could explain these results, and how could that work? And then that also points towards directions for, well, if this is how it works, perhaps then we should look there. Is that effect present or not? And if that effect is present, then we should take this action. If that effect is not present, then it probably doesn't matter much. And so I think in that way we can make progress in terms of a better understanding of what is a causal structure. And so that yeah, it's perhaps the best what I can say. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so you at halfway through the talk you talked about artificial intelligence and fairness and some problems that arise there if you think about these models. And well, in the past there were these artificial intelligence that were trained by looking at existing data, and that actually introduced more bias, like you explained. But I'm wondering how could we, I don't know much about artificial intelligence, but how could we train or sort of make artificial intelligence work in such a way that it doesn't introduce or reinforce bias? Do you know something about that? And could this maybe help actually?
So yes, I think it can help, and I think there are approaches which are very similar to what I've been presenting here that have a similar notion, let's say, of what constitutes bias or not. I don't think that what is a bias can be based on just the empirical studies, right? So it's not just, okay, you observe it, there's the causal structure. This requires well, more thinking, let's say. Did I already cross it? No, slightly back. So what I think is a possibility, at least in one way, yeah, here. So in this case, if this is again a hypothetical causal model, then we have a disparity in faculty position. Our prediction of the faculty position is fair, though it's not unfair, right? It doesn't show a disparity. It doesn't show any gender bias. It doesn't show any gender bias. And so this is a fair predictor to use. So, and this we know, not because of, let's say, other criteria that we could or could not apply. I haven't checked it out for this particular example where they say it's fair or not. But this suggests that if we use other factors for predicting something, then yes, we can get rid of, let's say, the biases and disparities that exist in the real data set, or in the real data set, in the real world, and that's we can see in the data set, and suggest prediction of outcomes that is fair, actually. So yes, I think it's possible to make fair predictions and make algorithms fair, but it requires us to know the causal structure. Right, so if faculty position would affect impact, right, then it would show a disparity in terms of our. So it depends exactly on how this operates. Right, in this hypothetical example, is just impacts and or prior impacts to faculty position affects whether they get faculty position or not. Probably later impact is determined partly by faculty position, prestige bias, and whatever. But if this operates the other way around, the prediction is again unfair, right? And so the causal structure is completely different, and the implications of the fairness is completely different, even though that all of the associations remain, well, not identical here, but we remain very similar. So it's not, let's say, the just seeing what type of associations we have, is understanding the causal structure. That is, I think, there should be driving also fairness concerns in algorithm predictions.
And then I was also wondering, so do you think there will come a time when algorithms will decide if somebody is hired for a job, or?
I hope not.
And then the other question was like, should we have that?
But it's already happening, right?
Yeah, at least initial selections. I know it's
Yes.
just final decisions, but
Yeah. So final decisions, I would hope not that it's so, let's say, simplistic. So part of the problem is, of course, and that is actually related to. Can I go to the end? Then. Thank you. And then back to this one. So the problem is, and that's similar to, let's say, hiring processes. There is the difficulty if we can't see quality directly, and so we get a review outcome or hiring, say, outcome that people review a CV and review your prior publication or whatever. But this might also be plagued by what we could call biases. I haven't drawn any biases here, but this prestige type of bias, that author and institutional bias are affecting the actual decision to hire somebody, right? And so is it clear that human judgment in terms of hiring decisions are superior, better, fair, more fair than automatic judgments? I'm not convinced that that is the case. I'm also not convinced that automatic hiring is better, right? Especially not in a simplistic way. So essentially, I don't have an answer, but I don't think that either way is saying that this is the way we achieve fairness, because we don't know exactly what are the actual biases also in human decision making. If we just mimic human decision making, we might just present exactly the same types of biases that were already present. So we should do something different, right? Whether that is really an improvement or whether that has its own biases again, not sure. We see different results at least. So. Other questions?
I'm just thinking out loud a bit.
Yeah, sure.
Like the piece that is causal structure, would that be like, is that best left to humans or to computers, like, or to algorithms? Would that be like an issue there, or do they work in tandem best? Or
Yeah, so that's
a statistical model or use common sense or both?
Yeah, excellent question. So there is a lot of work actually also in AI again, trying to discover causal structure. So trying to determine just based on a data set, throw it in, what is the potential causal structure that is underlying this. I think that makes sense to try to do some of these things automatically and try to deduce them, let's say, from whatever we see. Because there's certain patterns that are, let's say, induced by certain causal structures and not by other causal structures. This is unlikely to give unique results saying this is the truth. Let's say this is the causal structure that is underlying this particular data set. It's just saying, well, this is probably not the case. The rest of the causal structure, probably all bidirectional. We don't know. This probably not, because if we control for that, and then there's the question of unobserved variables. Are there many unobserved variables? Well, then yes, I don't know. And so I think it's a combination of. So yes, you might use, let's say, automated approaches for possible causal structures, but these give then suggestions for further research into what are the differences then that we might think about in order to say it's either this or that particular causal structure, especially when they're, let's say, policy relevant, seeing that this would imply that particular policy, well, this model would imply that particular policy, similar to the mentorship idea. then that might be a fruitful way of looking further into saying this should be researched, because if we know this, we can take more action quickly.
Do you think that reforms or policies that are introduced, like the ones that you mentioned, which might be misguided in light of the true causal structure, that we could use them as experiments or causal instruments to learn about the true causal structure?
That would be interesting in a sense. So you would expect, for example, some of these implicit bias trainings, if there is a bias there, then that should also be effective in the sense that it changes the outcomes there. If there's not this bias present, then you would not expect it. Of course, quota, like hiring policies, you should not hire more than 30%, or at least some companies have at least 30% women in office. Then obviously that will be the results, right? So that
Yeah,
is
but,
perhaps less
but,
informative.
but maybe there are ways in which you could infer other causal relationships of the model to that. Then,
Yeah, no, that might be an interesting possibility. So that is something. So I didn't draw an arrow here between quality and citation. This is one arrow that I think has some tentative evidence, which you wouldn't think at first. But if you look at reviews, for example, you look at reviews and see how they correlate with citations, how they associate with citations, you see a clear correlation there. If you control for journals, you don't see, well, any correlation in some cases, or negligible correlation between reviews and citations. So perhaps journals also affect review, right? That might be the case. But even then, it's not possible that there's still an error for quality citations, because if there were, they would still be associated. So I think that, let's say, also indirectly, you can try to infer these types of things where you know, or well, at least would be very expected that quality at least affects peer review. If that wouldn't be the case, then we can just better stop doing it. So maybe it's completely random, but then there's really no point. And so having these, let's say, further, so this is something that is not informed by empirical evidence, because we don't see quality, we don't observe quality. So we can't say, yes, quality is informing peer review, because how do we measure it? Through peer review. So it's sort of self-defeating. But then you could say, well, this link might not be present there. So there could be other effects, of course, for citations, which I haven't drawn here, and actual usefulness or something for other papers, whatever it could form citations. But at least if you get peer review results and compare them with citations, then controlling for the journal, they're independent or nearly independent. So yeah, would be great. You could also do something like that for these types of policies.
We're running out of time.
Call it a day.
Yeah, we're going to call it a day. So for the online audience, thanks for joining us today. All of us here are actually going to continue the discussion, but without you, unfortunately. So thanks for joining us. We hope to see you again online or here in Amsterdam, even better. And let's thank Vincent for a fascinating talk. Bye-bye.